I was only a step away from the study when I heard my father's voice. It wasn't raised in anger, just steady and certain, the kind of tone he used when signing contracts or dismissing people he considered unworthy. "She's not getting a single thing. She's out." The words sank into me like ice water poured straight down my spine. My hand froze on the banister, and the hallway suddenly felt colder than it had seconds before. Not the chill of air conditioning, but the kind of cold that comes from knowing something final has just been spoken. Words you can't rewind. I should have pushed open the door. I should have made some noise, let them know I was there. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning closer to the narrow crack, watching shadows move across the room. My father, Thomas Hughes, was leaning back in his leather chair, shoulders relaxed like he was talking about quarterly profits instead of his daughter's future. My younger brother, Daniel, sat across from him, tapping the edge of his phone with one restless finger. He didn't even look conflicted. My mother, Catherine, stood near the shelves, arms folded, lips pressed into a tight smile that told me everything I needed to know. That smile wasn't joy. It was victory. I didn't remember stepping away, but somehow I was already backing down the hall, breath shallow, palms damp. My old bedroom was just around the corner, but I didn't go there. I went to the guest room they'd shoved me into, the one with bare walls and a mattress that sagged in the middle. My room, the one I had painted myself, the one that smelled faintly of lavender, had been given to Daniel months ago. I sat on the bed, laptop balanced on my knees, and opened an account I had set up years ago in another city under another bank, a private fund. Back then, it had felt paranoid, unnecessary. Tonight, it felt like salvation. Every cent I had, savings, freelance earnings, even the small emergency stash I kept hidden, went into that account. My fingers trembled not with fear but with clarity. They thought they could erase me. They thought wrong. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream into my pillow or tear the sheets apart like I might have once upon a time. I just sat there, staring at the glow of the confirmation screen, watching my money move somewhere they couldn't reach. Something inside me shifted. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was the liability they underestimated, and that was going to be their mistake. But the truth is, it hadn't started with that conversation. Looking back, they had been erasing me long before they said it out loud. It was in the Christmas photo last year, the one my mother posted online with the caption, "Hughes family, stronger than ever." I wasn't in it. I had flown home 2 days early, baked pies, wrapped gifts until my fingers cramped. But when I asked why I'd been left out, she said, "Oh, Quinn, we took it while you were running errands." It slipped my mind. Slipped. My existence just slipped. I told myself it didn't matter, but deep down I knew better. The subtle comments came next. My father, always pragmatic, began saying things like, "You're too emotional to handle estate matters," or "This business requires a rational head." My brother echoed him, rolling his eyes when I questioned decisions, calling me dramatic. Even my cousin Marcus, who had grown up like a brother, nicknamed me the martyr. He said it with a laugh, but I could feel the sharpness beneath it. Still, I stayed. I was there when my grandmother, Alina, fell for the 3rd time and needed someone to sit with her through the night. I was there in the hospice room, reading to her until my throat was raw. I gave up my job in Boston to help Dad recover from heart surgery last spring. I covered Daniel's debts when he maxed out his credit cards, and I even wired money quietly to cover Marcus's poker habit when it spiraled again. They never said thank you. They just took it, as if it was expected. And maybe that was my first mistake, confusing being needed with being wanted. The real cut came a few weeks later, the second conversation I wasn't meant to hear. The study door was cracked again, and Dad's voice carried like it always did when he thought the walls were his only audience. "Don't tell her about the account. We'll say it was closed. Split it between us. Quinn's out. She's been a burden long enough." Burden? That single word echoed through me louder than any slammed door or shouted insult ever could. It didn't matter that I had been the one to patch their holes, to carry their weight. In their eyes, all of it had just made me disposable. I remember standing in the hallway, just breathing. Not because I was afraid, but because part of me was breaking, the part that still wanted to believe they were just grieving. That stress had warped their kindness. But it wasn't grief. It was greed, naked and unapologetic. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I kept hearing my grandmother's voice, faint and raspy from the hospital bed. "One day, they'll turn on you. When they do, open the bottom drawer." At the time, I had thought she meant something sentimental, an old photo, a keepsake, maybe a letter. But as the hours stretched long and the weight of her words pressed harder, I began to wonder if she had meant something else entirely. The drawer was in her bedroom, the one no one had dared touch since the funeral. Early the next morning, before anyone else woke, I went inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, like time itself had stopped the moment she passed. Her writing desk stood by the window, oak polished but worn. My hands shook as I reached for the top left drawer and pulled. It wasn't empty. Inside lay a small flash drive, a folded letter in her careful cursive, and a cream-colored envelope sealed with a notary stamp. The letter was thin, no more than a page, but my hands trembled as I unfolded it. My grandmother's handwriting was steady, the loops familiar, the kind of cursive she had taught me to copy as a child when we sat together at that same desk. Quinn, if you're reading this, they've already made their move. Blood does not make them worthy. Love does not make them loyal. Take what's yours and don't apologize. I read it once. Then again. The words hit me like a thunderclap. It wasn't just advice. It was a warning, a command, a blessing, all wrapped into 4 sharp lines. I pressed the page against my chest, trying to breathe through the sudden weight. My grandmother had known. She had seen them for what they were long before I allowed myself to. She hadn't been blinded by obligation or sentiment. She had prepared me. The sealed envelope was heavier. I tore it open carefully, sliding out several pages thick with official stamps and signatures. My eyes caught the first line, and the air left my lungs. An amended will, dated 2 weeks before she died. I read each line slowly, carefully, as though my life depended on absorbing every word, because in a way, it did. She hadn't split her assets evenly. She hadn't chosen diplomacy or compromise. She had given me 51% of the family business, power of attorney over my father's personal trust, 2 rental properties in Colorado, and an investment account worth over $1 million. I gripped the papers so tightly they crinkled. She hadn't left me power. She had left me proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't imagining the distance and the dismissive smiles. Proof that I mattered, even if my parents wanted me erased. And then there was the flash drive. I turned it over in my hand, the plastic smooth and unremarkable. But my grandmother had been deliberate. If she'd hidden this alongside the will, it wasn't trivial. It was ammunition. I didn't plug it in that morning. I wasn't ready for whatever truths it held. All I knew was that the ground beneath me had shifted. By the time I walked into the kitchen, the envelope was tucked firmly inside my bag, my expression carefully neutral. My father sat at the head of the table, already combing through financial reports. Daniel was scrolling through his phone with the detached boredom of someone who never worried about consequences. My mother was stirring her tea, humming a tune she always used when she thought she'd won. "Morning," I said. My voice was calm, almost casual. My father didn't look up. "We're busy, Quinn. Can you give us a minute?" I smiled, practiced, and cool. "Of course, just wanted to say congratulations." That got his attention. He set down his pen, eyebrows tightening. My mother's humming faltered. Daniel looked up, suspicious. I pulled the envelope from my bag and placed it gently on the table, right between the butter dish and Dad's black coffee. For a second, no one moved. Then Mom's hand jerked, spilling tea across the counter. She didn't even reach for a towel, she just stared. "What is this?" she asked. I opened the envelope, slid the amended will onto the table, and smoothed it flat. "This is everything," I said. Daniel froze, his phone slipping from his hand onto the table with a clatter. My father leaned forward, eyes darting across the page. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "That's not real," Mom whispered. "Signed, notarized, witnessed," I replied evenly. I tapped the bottom of the document. "You remember Patricia, Grandma's friend from her church? She co-signed 2 weeks before the funeral." The silence was thick enough to choke on. My father's jaw tightened. "You stole this." "No," I said, voice steady. "I earned it." My mother's lips trembled. "This is your family." I met her gaze, unflinching. "No, this is a lesson." The room hung in stillness, the weight of the truth pressing down on all of us. My father's face darkened, Daniel's skin drained of color, and my mother's facade cracked just enough for me to see the fear beneath. I picked up the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it into my bag once more. Then I turned and walked out, not running, not hiding, just claiming the ground they thought I would never dare to stand on. That morning marked the end of who I used to be. I wasn't the daughter they dismissed anymore. I wasn't the sister they ridiculed or the pawn they expected to sacrifice. I was Quinn Hughes, and they had no idea what I was about to do. I used to believe that a wound wasn't real unless it left a scar. Something visible. Something undeniable. But I learned the hard way that the deepest wounds are the ones no one else can see. The ones that slip in quietly, disguised as jokes, excuses, or silence. Invisible cuts. The first one came the December after I turned 25. My mother mailed out our annual Hughes family Christmas card, the one she curated like a corporate campaign, every detail perfectly arranged. The picture was flawless. My father, tall and proud in a red sweater, my mother leaning against him with her polished smile, Daniel standing between them with his arm draped casually over her shoulder. Even Marcus was there, grinning like he belonged more than I ever had. I was. It was the year I baked 3 pies, spent hours wrapping gifts until my fingers cramped, and strung the lights when Dad couldn't climb the ladder. I'd flown in early just so Mom wouldn't feel overwhelmed. I had been there. Yet when I asked about the missing photo, she gave me a casual shrug. "Oh, Quinn, we took it while you were out running errands." It slipped my mind. Slipped. Like my existence was some minor detail she forgot to jot on her to-do list. I laughed when she said it, but the sound was hollow even to my own ears. That laugh was the bandage I used to cover the first invisible cut. The second came in the form of my father's voice. He had always been sharp, pragmatic, the type of man who thought emotions were weaknesses better left locked away. But he didn't used to use them against me, not until he started reminding me, again and again, that I wasn't fit for responsibility. "You're too emotional to handle estate matters, Quinn. This requires a rational head, not feelings." He'd say it in the same tone he used when instructing Daniel about investments, except the message was different. To Daniel, his tone carried faith. To me, it carried dismissal. I learned to shrink under those words, to nod and pretend they didn't sting. But they carved another line into me, just as invisible and just as deep. Daniel followed his lead quickly, almost eagerly. My younger brother had always been spoiled, shielded from the sharp edges of life. He wore arrogance like cologne, thick and suffocating. When I asked questions about the company accounts, or suggested we cut back on unnecessary spending, he'd roll his eyes like I was performing on some stage. "God, Quinn, you're so dramatic, always making everything into a scene." And Marcus, my cousin who grew up eating the same meals and sleeping on the same couches as I did, he turned my sacrifices into a joke. "Here comes the martyr," he'd say when I stayed late to help clean up, when I canceled plans to take Grandma to the doctor, when I lent him money to keep his poker debt collectors quiet. He said it with a grin, but the word cut deeper than he realized. Martyr. It was supposed to mean noble, selfless, but in his mouth it was a taunt, a reminder that even my sacrifices had become a punchline. Still, I stayed. I told myself families were worth it. That loyalty meant something. That maybe if I kept showing up, if I kept filling the cracks, eventually they'd see me for who I was. So I was there, every time they needed me. I was there when Grandma fell again, bruising her hip badly enough to keep her in the hospital overnight. No one else wanted to stay. My father had meetings. My mother had a gala. Daniel claimed he had finals, though I later found out he was at a bar. So I sat in that sterile hospital room, reading aloud until my throat was raw, holding Grandma's hand while she drifted in and out of sleep. Her hand was so small in mine, frail but warm. She whispered my name once, soft as a prayer, and I knew I couldn't leave her. I was there when Dad had surgery last spring. I walked away from a consulting job in Boston, a job I had clawed my way into because he needed someone to manage his recovery. He didn't thank me. Not once. In his eyes, it was expected. I was there when Daniel maxed out his credit cards again. His messages lit up my phone. "Please, Quinn, just this once. Don't tell Mom and Dad." I wired him the money, drained my savings without hesitation. He never paid me back. He never even said thank you. I was there when Marcus's gambling spiraled. He came to me reeking of whiskey, sweat dripping down his temples, his voice shaking as he admitted how much he owed. I didn't lecture him. I didn't yell. I pulled cash from the account I had been building for years, telling myself I was buying him time. He promised he'd get clean. 2 weeks later, he was back at the tables. Every time, I convinced myself that being needed was enough. That being needed meant being loved. But the truth was harsher. Being needed only meant being convenient. And convenience is temporary. The night after I laid the amended will on the kitchen table, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the sagging guest bed, staring at the ceiling while shadows from the branches outside crawled across the plaster. Every memory, every small betrayal replayed like a reel in my head. The Christmas card, the dismissive tone, the jokes at my expense, the way they erased me, little by little, until I barely recognized myself in their eyes. It hit me then. The conversation in the study wasn't the betrayal. It was just the confession. They had been cutting me out long before I caught them plotting. The cruelest part was that I had let them. I had kept showing up, kept believing that if I worked harder, if I sacrificed more, they would finally see me. But the more I gave, the easier it became for them to take without guilt. That's when the word came back, sharp and unrelenting. Burden, my father's voice replayed in my head. She's been a burden long enough. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the stubborn beat of my heart. Each thump was proof that I wasn't broken yet. And then, through the haze of exhaustion, I heard her voice again. My grandmother's, soft, raspy, but steady. One day, they'll turn on you. When they do, open the bottom drawer. Those words had saved me once already. They reminded me that she had seen them clearly when I still chose blindness. They reminded me that even when my family called me weak, dramatic, a burden, someone had known the truth. The invisible cuts were real. And if they thought they could keep bleeding me dry without consequence, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Because invisible cuts don't heal quietly. They leave scars you can't ignore forever. And scars, once traced, can lead you straight back to the blade. The morning after that sleepless night, I walked into the kitchen half expecting the world to look different. It didn't. The same oak cabinets, the same clock ticking above the doorway, the same smell of strong coffee drifting from my father's mug. But everything had shifted. I sat down at the table, hoping for some crack in their armor, some sign of guilt. There was none. My father was reading financial reports, glasses perched on the edge of his nose. Daniel scrolled through his phone, occasionally smirking at something only he could see. My mother stirred her tea slowly, humming again, that same tune. The one she saved for moments of control. She didn't even look at me, invisible. Again, I cleared my throat. Morning. Busy, my father said without glancing up. Just one word, clipped and cold. Daniel didn't bother acknowledging me. My mother's humming never faltered. I sat there, staring at them, waiting for I don't even know what. An apology, a mistake, a flicker of recognition. Nothing came. So I picked up my plate and left, my footsteps echoing in a house that felt less and less like home. Later that afternoon, I found Daniel in the den, sprawled on the couch with a controller in his hand. Video game noises filled the room, gunshots, explosions, cheers from invisible crowds. He barely looked up when I walked in. "You really think you can play this game, Quinn?" he asked, eyes still on the screen. "What game?" I asked, even though I already knew. "This inheritance thing, the will, the board, all of it, you don't belong." His voice was casual, dismissive, like he was explaining rules to someone too naive to understand. I stepped closer, forcing him to pause the game. "I belonged enough to bail you out when your credit card companies were calling every night." His jaw tightened, but he smirked anyway. "That was your choice. Don't act like a savior now." "No," I said quietly. "That was family, or at least what I thought family was." He rolled his eyes and unpaused the game, blasting back into the noise. Conversation over. Another invisible cut. That evening, I went for a walk around the lake. The air was cold, crisp, carrying the smell of pine. The Hughes house loomed behind me, warm lights glowing in the windows, but they felt like a fortress meant to keep me out rather than welcome me in. I thought of Grandma Alina, her laugh, her sharp eyes that saw more than she ever admitted. The way she used to squeeze my hand when we walked through this very path. She had been the only one who looked at me like I was more than background noise. And then I remembered her warning again. One day, they'll turn on you. When they do, open the bottom drawer. By the time I returned to the house, my chest was tight with determination. I waited until the halls were quiet, until I could hear only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, then slipped into her room. It smelled the same, lavender sachets tucked in drawers, cedar lingering in the wood. Dust floated in the light from the window, as though time itself had paused. Her desk sat against the far wall, polished oak with brass handles dulled by age. I hesitated only once before pulling the top left drawer. It wasn't empty. Inside lay 3 items, a folded letter in her steady cursive, a cream-colored envelope sealed with a notary stamp, and a flash drive no bigger than my thumb. My throat tightened as I picked up the letter first. My grandmother's handwriting was deliberate, every loop precise, every word chosen with care. "Quinn, if you're reading this, they've already made their move. Blood does not make them worthy. Love does not make them loyal. Take what's yours and don't apologize." The words burned through me, not sadness, not rage, conviction. Next came the envelope. I broke the seal carefully as if the paper might disintegrate if I wasn't gentle enough. Inside was a document thick with signatures and stamps. My grandmother's amended will, dated just 2 weeks before she died. I read each line, slowly, carefully, the way you read scripture when you want to believe in salvation. 51% of the family business. Power of attorney over my father's trust, 2 rental properties, an investment account worth more than $1 million. She hadn't tried to divide everything equally. She hadn't tried to keep the peace. She had chosen me, not because I was better, not because I was her favorite, but because I had stayed, because I had held her hand when no one else would. She hadn't left me wealth. She had left me proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining the erasure, the silence, the smirks. Proof that I wasn't crazy. And then, finally, I held the flash drive. Plain, unmarked, but heavy in my palm with all the possibility of what it might contain. I didn't plug it in that night. I couldn't. Not yet. All I knew was this. I had thought I was bleeding alone from invisible cuts, but my grandmother had seen every single one of them. And she had armed me with the blade to cut back. The letter sat in my lap long after I finished reading it. The words blurred as my eyes traced the loops of my grandmother's handwriting again and again, as if the ink itself could shield me. 4 lines, that was all. 4 lines that cracked my world open. Blood does not make them worthy. Love does not make them loyal. I whispered it under my breath, tasting each word like it was both poison and medicine. My grandmother had known. She had known they would turn on me. She had seen the greed in their eyes, the cracks in their voices, the selfishness I still tried to excuse. She had seen me, too, the one they tried to erase, and she had chosen me. The will was thick, weighty, stamped with official notary seals. 51% of the company. Power of attorney over my father's trust. Properties. An account worth more than $1 million. Numbers and titles and signatures lined the pages like armor, proof that I wasn't powerless, proof that the boardroom didn't belong solely to men in tailored suits who smirked at my questions. But it wasn't the numbers that made my chest tight. It was the intent. She hadn't left me scraps. She hadn't tried to balance fairness with appeasement. She had drawn a sharp line, placed me firmly on one side, and left the rest of them on the other. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one patching their holes. I was the one holding the foundation. The flash drive was still in my palm, small, plastic, ordinary, and yet it pulsed with weight. My grandmother had hidden it alongside her will for a reason. I turned it over between my fingers, tempted to open my laptop and see what secrets it held. But my stomach twisted at the thought. Some truths can't be unseen. I slipped it into the pocket of my jacket instead, tucking it close to my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring out the window at the lake. The water was black glass, perfectly still. I thought about how many times I stood there with Grandma, how she used to say water reflects truth, you can't stare too long without seeing yourself. I wasn't sure I liked what I saw. The next morning, I moved differently. Not louder, not more confident, but steadier. There was no rush in my steps, no panic in my eyes. Inside me, something had shifted. At breakfast, I found them all waiting as usual. My father already buried in reports, Daniel scrolling on his phone, my mother humming her victory tune. I set the envelope down on the table. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Their eyes flicked to the will, to me, to each other. My mother's hand trembled. My father's face darkened. Daniel's smirk finally slipped. "You thought I'd go quietly," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was calm, almost casual, the way Grandma used to speak when she wanted to cut through noise. "You thought you could erase me with a smile and a folded napkin, but you underestimated me." No one answered, not at first. My father finally leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "You stole this." "No," I said, my gaze never leaving his. "I earned it." The conversation ended there, but the shift was irreversible. I saw it in their eyes, the first flicker of fear. That afternoon, I drove into town with the envelope still tucked in my bag. I went to the bank, confirmed every account listed in the will, every signature matched, every detail was airtight. When I left the building, sunlight poured over me like it hadn't in years. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, not with fear, with clarity. They had wanted me erased. Instead, I had become undeniable. Back at the house, I sat at Grandma's old desk again. The flash drive lay in front of me, silent, waiting. I knew it was the next step. Whatever was inside would either solidify my power or shatter me. I plugged it into my laptop. The screen blinked. A single folder appeared, labeled in her neat typing, "For Quinn only." My pulse raced as I clicked it open. Inside were documents, financial spreadsheets, scans of letters, notes in Grandma's handwriting. Each file was like a thread, weaving a web I hadn't known existed. And at the bottom of the folder, a video file. I hovered over it, breath caught in my throat. My grandmother's face, her voice, her truth, locked in those pixels, but I couldn't press play. Not yet. Instead, I closed the laptop and pressed my palms against the wood of her desk. "Not yet," I whispered. "But soon." The flash drive sat in my bag like a pulse I couldn't ignore. Everywhere I went in the house, I felt it, pressing against me as if it wanted to speak. Every time I passed my father's study, Every time Daniel's laugh carried down the hall, every time my mother's voice floated from the kitchen, it was there. Waiting. That evening, I took it out again, holding it in my hand while the house settled into its nightly rhythm. My father retreated to his office with his bourbon, Daniel disappeared into the den with his games, and my mother called a friend, her voice soft and lilting, practiced for an audience that still believed her version of events. I locked the guest room door and sat cross-legged on the bed, laptop open. The folder was still there, for Quinn only. I clicked through the files one by one. There were spreadsheets, detailed financial accounts, transfers that looked routine but weren't, notes scribbled in Grandma's handwriting. Ask why Daniel needed $40,000 in cash withdrawals, cross-check Catherine's consulting payments with shell companies, Thomas's Cayman account, verify source. My throat tightened. She had seen everything. Not only their disdain, but their theft. For years, I had blamed myself for being too suspicious, too emotional. But the truth was clearer than I'd ever dared to admit. They weren't just cutting me out. They were bleeding the family dry. At the bottom of the folder sat the video file. Its presence felt heavier than all the rest combined. I double-clicked. The screen went black for a moment, then lit up with my grandmother's face. Her hair was thinner, her skin pale, but her eyes, those sharp, unwavering eyes, looked straight into me. "Quinn," she said, her voice raspy but steady, "if you're seeing this, they've already made their choice." I froze, breath trapped in my chest. "You are the only one who stayed," she continued. "The only one who listened. They'll tell you you're too weak, too emotional, too much. Don't believe them. You are the only one I trust to carry this forward. Not their version of the family. Yours." Her hand trembled as she adjusted the camera. For a moment, I thought she might break down, but she didn't. "I wish I could protect you longer, but this is how I protect you now, with truth." The screen went dark. I sat there, staring at the black square, my reflection faint in the glass. My eyes burned, but no tears fell. I had cried too many times for them already. This wasn't grief. This was confirmation. I closed the laptop gently, like it was something fragile. For the first time, I felt the weight shift from victim to weapon. They thought I was weak. They thought I was erased. But I had the will, I had the proof, and I had her voice, immortalized in that recording, steadying me when my own would falter. I slipped the drive back into my pocket. When I left the guest room, I moved differently. Not cautious, not invisible. My steps echoed down the hall with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. Daniel glanced up from the couch as I passed, his smirk half-formed before fading at the look on my face. My mother paused mid-conversation, eyes narrowing as though she sensed something had shifted. My father stepped into the hall, glass in hand, and studied me for a moment too long. No one spoke, but they felt it. The balance had changed. Later, as I stood by the window overlooking the lake, the words repeated in my head like a mantra. Not their version of the family. Yours. The invisible cuts still ached, but they weren't open wounds anymore. They were scars, lines of proof etched into my skin, reminders of every time they tried to bury me. And now I wasn't standing in their shadow. I was standing on the edge of something new. They thought they had already played their last card, but the truth was the game had only just begun. I didn't storm the castle. That would have been too obvious, too desperate. Instead, I chose silence. Calculated silence. For 3 days, I kept my grandmother's will tucked in my bag, the flash drive hidden in the lining of my jacket. I ate meals at the same table, sat in the same rooms, listened to the same dismissive comments, but everything was different. Inside, I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was the storm they hadn't noticed gathering. I started small. A phone call to the bank. A polite inquiry about one of my father's accounts. A request to flag certain transfers under Daniel's name. My grandmother's power of attorney letter unlocked doors I hadn't even known existed. Each time a banker confirmed my authority, I felt a spark of validation. It was real. It was mine. By the 4th morning, I was ready. They were all gathered in the kitchen again, the daily ritual of toast, coffee, and silence. My father leafed through financial reports, brow furrowed in concentration. Daniel scrolled endlessly on his phone. My mother hummed that same tune, her false lullaby. I walked in with the envelope in my hand. "Morning," I said casually, sliding into a chair. My father grunted, not looking up. Daniel muttered something under his breath. My mother kept humming. I let the silence stretch, then set the envelope down in the middle of the table. The sound of paper against wood was louder than it should have been. My father's pen froze. Daniel glanced up. My mother's humming stopped mid-note. "What's that?" my father asked. I leaned back calm. "A gift from Grandma." Their eyes followed my hand as I unfolded the amended will and smoothed it flat between the butter dish and Dad's coffee. For a moment, the room was frozen. My father's eyes scanned the page, his jaw tightening with each line. My mother's lips parted as though she might protest, but no words came out. Daniel's smirk collapsed entirely, replaced by something pale and brittle. "This isn't real," my father said at last, his voice low and dangerous. "Signed, notarized, witnessed," I replied evenly. "Trisha from Grandma's church co-signed. You remember her, don't you?" No one answered. "You stole this," he growled, pushing back his chair so violently it scraped against the floor. I held his gaze. "No, I earned it." The words hung between us, thick as smoke. Daniel slammed his phone onto the table. "What the hell is happening? Are you saying she left everything to you?" "Not everything," I said, folding the paper with deliberate care. "Just enough to correct the balance." My mother's voice trembled. "This is your family." I met her eyes. "No, this is a lesson." I stood, tucking the envelope back into my bag. None of them moved, not a word, not a breath. For once, I had the silence. And then I walked out, not running, not hiding, just claiming the ground they thought I'd never stand on. Later that afternoon, I drove downtown and walked through the glass doors of Hughes & Co. for the first time in years. The receptionist blinked at me as if I were a ghost, then quickly straightened when I handed her the ownership documents. "I need the boardroom," I said. She hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" I smiled. "I own the building." Her cheeks flushed crimson as she scrambled to escort me upstairs. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and stale cologne. Familiar faces sat around the long table: William, Elizabeth, a few new executives, and Marcus in a tailored blazer, leaning back like he'd already won something. He didn't even look at me. I walked straight to the head of the table and sat down. His head snapped toward me, eyes wide. "You don't belong here," he hissed under his breath. I slid the ownership documents across the table. "According to this, I belong exactly here." The silence was sharp, brittle. William cleared his throat, scanning the pages carefully. "We weren't made aware of this change in leadership," he said. I met his gaze. "You are now." The door burst open. My father stormed in, breathless, face flushed with anger. His eyes locked on me instantly. "This is a hostile takeover," he barked. "No," I said, my voice calm, steady. "This is a correction." My father marched toward me, his steps echoing like thunder across the polished floor. He slammed his palm against the table, leaning close enough that I could smell the sharp sting of bourbon on his breath. "You don't have the experience," he spat. "And yet," I said, sliding the documents back toward me, "I have the authority." A ripple moved through the room, murmurs, shifting chairs, nervous glances. Elizabeth leaned forward, squinting at the signatures. William folded his hands, watching me more closely now, as though he were seeing me for the first time. "You've been gone for years," my father snapped. "You don't understand how this company runs? Then it's time it runs differently," I answered. "Starting today, every transaction over $10,000 goes through me." The room went still. For a moment, all I heard was the steady tick of the wall clock. Marcus laughed suddenly, sharp and bitter. "You really think you're going to run this place better than Dad? Please, you don't have the stomach for it." I turned my gaze on him. "Funny. Considering you've been using company funds to pay off your poker debts." His smirk vanished. His face drained of color and whispers erupted around the table. Someone pulled out a phone. Another coughed nervously, shifting papers. "You're bluffing," Marcus muttered, but his voice shook. I leaned forward. "Am I? Because I've got the audit reports. Transfers labeled as consulting fees. Equipment rentals that never existed. Offshore payments that all lead back to you." William's eyes widened. Elizabeth scribbled something on her notepad. The air in the room thickened with unease. My father's face turned crimson. "You've crossed the line." "No, Dad," I said, my voice rising just enough to slice through the tension. "You crossed it years ago. I'm just drawing it in ink so everyone can see." He stared at me, chest heaving, but he didn't deny it. "Couldn't. This isn't just about power," I continued, addressing the board now. "It's about transparency. Something this company hasn't seen since Grandma stepped down." William nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "She always said you were the one who asked the real questions." My throat tightened, but I kept my face steady. "She taught me well." For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across the faces of the board members, not at me, but at him, my father, the man they had followed without question for decades. When the meeting adjourned, most of them left quickly, heads down, papers clutched tightly in their hands. Marcus bolted without looking at me, his shoulders stiff with humiliation, but my father stayed. He followed me into the hallway, his footsteps heavy behind me. "You're really doing this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its thunder. I stopped, turning to face him. "You already did, when you decided I was disposable." For a moment, I didn't see the man who raised me. I saw someone hollow, someone desperate to cling to control. His shoulders sagged, his eyes tired. "You'll regret this," he said, almost a whisper. I rested my hand on the doorframe of the office they once told me I wasn't qualified to enter. "No, Dad, I regretted trusting you. This is the cure." I walked inside without waiting for his response. By the end of the day, the audit team had their marching orders. Every file tied to Marcus, every shell company under my father's name, every suspicious contract linked to my mother, all of it went under review. The deeper they dug, the darker it got. Clean names, dirty money, lines and lines of transactions disguised as strategy, offshore accounts, phantom vendors, consulting fees funneled to nowhere. It wasn't mismanagement. It was theft, coordinated, deliberate theft. When I finally shut off my laptop that night, my hands were cold against the keyboard. Not from fear, from clarity. They thought they had silenced me. They thought the cuts they left would keep me bleeding in the dark, but I wasn't bleeding anymore. I was sharpening. The boardroom was colder the second time I walked in, not because of the air conditioning, but because the air itself had shifted. The last time, they saw me as a disruption. This time, they knew I was a threat. The long table gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Leather chairs lined either side like sentinels, each occupied by faces tight with anticipation. William sat near the center, adjusting his tie nervously. Elizabeth tapped her pen against her notepad, her eyes sharp and calculating. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to look unaffected, though the flush in his cheeks betrayed him. At the head of the table, my father already waited, posture rigid, jaw tight. Daniel sat at his side, looking like a shadow of him, eager to imitate but lacking the gravitas. My mother was not present. She preferred working from behind curtains, never in the spotlight where accountability lived. I walked straight to the chair opposite my father and sat down. The scrape of the leather against the floor echoed like a declaration. "Let's begin," I said. A murmur swept the room, a mix of surprise and discomfort. My father slammed his hand on the table. "You don't chair this meeting." I slid the notarized documents across the polished wood. "According to this, I do." William cleared his throat, glancing nervously between us. "The documents are valid, Thomas. We verified them." The muscle in my father's jaw twitched, but he didn't argue. I opened a folder, laying out pages of reports for the board to see. "We'll start with transparency, something this company hasn't had in years. Here are the audits from the last quarter. You'll notice several discrepancies." I flipped the first page, my voice steady. Funds labeled as consulting fees, routed to shell companies that don't exist. Payments to offshore accounts under aliases tied back to this family. The room shifted. Chairs squeaked. William leaned forward. Elizabeth's pen froze mid-tap. I turned toward Marcus. "And then there are the withdrawals disguised as vendor payments. Tens of thousands funneled into your personal accounts. Care to explain why a vendor named Skyline Logistics shares your home address?" His face went white. "That's not," I cut him off. "It is, I have the receipts." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered at the far end, and another board member scribbled furiously in his notebook. Marcus sputtered, looking desperately at my father. "You're just going to let her?" But my father's silence said everything. I turned back to the room. "This isn't mismanagement, this is theft. Coordinated, intentional, and it stops today." Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice cool and precise. "Do you have proof beyond these spreadsheets?" I met her gaze and slid another folder forward. "Bank confirmations, transfers flagged by compliance, everything is verified." The silence that followed was heavy. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing into me, measuring me, wondering if I would break. But I didn't. It was then that William leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. His voice was quiet but clear. "Before she passed, a leaner spoke to me. She told me to watch you, Quinn. To see if you'd step into your strength. She said if you did, the company would be safe." Every head in the room turned toward him. My father's eyes narrowed, fury flashing behind them. "You never mentioned this," he snapped. William didn't flinch. "Because I wasn't sure. Until now." A spark of something fierce ignited in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't standing alone at the long table. The silence after William spoke stretched across the room like a drawn bow. Every face turned toward me, some skeptical, some curious, some suddenly calculating what it would mean if I won. My father's hands curled into fists on the table. Eleanor was sentimental. She didn't understand what it takes to run a corporation. "No," William said calmly. "She understood better than anyone, and she trusted Quinn." The name hung in the air, my name, not as a liability, not as a burden, but as a choice. My father's gaze snapped back to me, burning with fury. "This is betrayal." I leaned forward, my voice steady. No, Dad, this is accountability. Across the table, Daniel shifted uneasily. He had inherited my father's arrogance but not his composure. His knee bounced under the table, his hands fidgeted. When the whispers grew louder, he suddenly burst out, "She doesn't know what she's doing. She's emotional, unstable, you've all seen it." I turned to him slowly. Emotional, maybe, but unstable? I slid a file toward him. You've been using company credit lines to cover your gambling debts. Multiple transactions, multiple casinos. Would you like me to read them out loud? His mouth opened, but no words came. His face drained of color as Elizabeth leaned forward, scanning the papers with narrowed eyes. "This is serious," she said, her voice cool. "Very serious." Daniel looked at my father for help, but he didn't move. He just stared at me, hollow fury etched into his features. I straightened in my chair, letting the silence settle before I spoke again. "This company isn't your playground anymore. It isn't your bank. It isn't your safety net. From this day forward, every decision will be transparent, every transaction accountable. If that's uncomfortable for you, then maybe you've been too comfortable for too long." The words rang louder than I expected. For a moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Elizabeth nodded slowly, tapping her pen once against the table. "I'm with her." William followed without hesitation. "So am I," a third voice chimed in, then a fourth. I watched the tide shift in real time. One by one, the board members leaned toward me, their gazes no longer dismissive but expectant. My father slammed his hand against the table again, his voice rising. "You're making a mistake. She'll destroy everything we've built." I held his eyes. "No, I'm saving it from everything you've destroyed." The vote wasn't formal, not yet, but it didn't need to be. The current was already moving, and it was moving toward me. By the time the meeting adjourned, the long table didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a throne, not one I had taken by force, but one I had been preparing for without even realizing it. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every invisible cut, they had all led me here. As the others filed out, William paused by my chair. He leaned close, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Your grandmother was right. You're stronger than they ever understood. Don't waste that." I swallowed hard, nodding once. When the doors closed, only my father and Daniel remained. Daniel muttered something under his breath, too quiet to catch. My father's stare was a blade, sharp and cold. "You think you've won," he said finally, "but this isn't over." I stood, gathering the files into my bag. "No, Dad, this is just the beginning." I walked out of the boardroom with the weight of 100 eyes on my back. But for the first time, the weight didn't crush me. It carried me, because the war at the long table wasn't about survival anymore. It was about legacy. And legacy was mine now. The boardroom victory wasn't the end, it was only the spark. Because once the silence cracked, once the truth leaked into daylight, they couldn't pretend anymore. And people like my parents didn't go quietly. They adapted, they twisted, they attacked. The first strike came that night. Daniel showed up at my office uninvited, his shirt wrinkled, his face pale. He didn't knock, just barged in, slamming the door shut behind him. "You're going to ruin us," he said, his voice trembling with anger or fear, I couldn't tell which. I didn't look up from the reports I was reviewing. "You ruined yourself, Daniel. I'm just holding up the mirror." He leaned across my desk, eyes wild. "Do you think this makes you a hero? You're tearing the family apart." I pushed the file toward him, records of his withdrawals, the casino receipts, the forged approvals. "Family doesn't build empires on lies. Family doesn't erase you and call it loyalty. You did this, not me." For once, he didn't have a comeback. His lips parted, but no words came out. The cocky grin he always wore was gone, replaced by something raw and exposed. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "You can walk away." I stood, my voice steady. "I don't have to, I want to." He left without another word. The second strike came from my mother. She texted me the next morning, 1 hour, no lawyers, meet me at St. Paul's Garden. I didn't owe her anything, but I went. The garden was quiet, rows of roses lining the stone path. She was already sitting on a bench, dressed in a crisp white blouse, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. "I underestimated you," she said as I approached. "You always did," I replied. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "You think you've won something, but what happens after? Do you really think you'll find peace with all this?" I met her gaze. Peace was what Grandma wanted. She wanted truth. Her voice sharpened. "I kept this family together. I covered your father's failures. I managed Daniel. I even managed you. Do you think you could survive one day without me?" "I already have," I said. "The difference is I don't need to lie about it." For the first time, her composure cracked. Her mouth trembled, not with anger but with something closer to grief. "Everything crumbles, Quinn, even the truth, just wait." I didn't answer. I turned and walked away, her words chasing me like shadows I refused to carry. The third strike came from my father. He didn't confront me directly. Instead, he unleashed his lawyers, flooding my inbox with letters, accusations, and threats. Fraud, mismanagement, emotional instability. They painted me as the reckless daughter who had conned her dying grandmother into changing her will. For a moment, I felt the sting of it. The humiliation, the sheer gall of them to twist the story that way. But then I remembered the flash drive in my jacket. They weren't just fighting me, they were fighting the truth. And truth, I had learned, doesn't crumble when you shine a light on it. Lies do. By the time the court date arrived, I was ready. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, the air itself felt still, tense, like even the walls were waiting to hear what couldn't be unsaid. My parents sat side by side at the defense table, masks of composure stretched tight over their faces. Daniel sat behind them, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Their lawyers shuffled papers, whispering strategies. When my name was called, I stood. My hands didn't shake as I swore my truth. Fear still lingered in me, but it didn't control me anymore. I had lived in their silence long enough. Now I would speak. I laid out the timeline, the account transfers, the forged approvals, the shell companies, the debts hidden behind polished ledgers. I spoke calmly, clearly, the way my grandmother had taught me to read a passage slow enough to let every word sink. And then I paused. Before she died, I said, my grandmother left me something else. I reached into my bag and pulled out the flash drive. The courtroom hushed. I handed it to the bailiff, who plugged it into the system. The speakers crackled, and then her voice filled the room. The speakers crackled once more, and then her voice poured into the room. Quinn, my grandmother said, her tone fragile but steady, if they try to shut you out, don't let them. You are this family's future, not their version of it yours. The sound of her voice hit me harder than any cross-examination could. For a heartbeat, I was back in her room, holding her hand, feeling her strength even when her body was failing. But then the courtroom shifted. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes darted toward the floor. Daniel froze completely, his hands white-knuckled on the back of the chair in front of him. The video continued. They will tell you you're weak. They will tell you you're too emotional. That's because they fear you. They fear what they can't control. Don't be afraid of their lies. Stand. Speak. Protect what is rightfully yours. And then the screen went dark. Silence swept the room. A silence not of doubt this time, but of revelation. The judge cleared his throat. The evidence is admissible. Combined with the financial records, it establishes a consistent pattern of mismanagement and fraud. My father's lawyer jumped up. Objection, this is hearsay, emotional manipulation. Overruled, the judge said flatly. My father's face darkened, but he said nothing. When it was my mother's turn to testify, she rose gracefully, smoothing her blouse as if preparing for church. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. We weren't trying to hurt Quinn. We were trying to protect her. She's always been sensitive. I laughed. I couldn't stop myself, not bitterly, not mockingly, but with the clarity of someone who had finally heard the truth too many times to care. Is that what you call erasing someone now? I asked. Sensitivity? A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge didn't flinch. Daniel looked down at his lap. By the time the testimony ended, the money didn't even matter. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about dignity, about memory, about being seen. The gavel struck. The ruling was final. I retained full control of the estate. Daniel was ordered to pay restitution for his unauthorized use of company funds. My parents were permanently barred from all fiduciary roles tied to the trust and the family business. It was official. It was public, it was irreversible. Outside, the reporters waited like vultures, microphones raised, cameras flashing. Questions flew. How does it feel to win? What happens to your family now? Do you forgive them? I didn't answer. I didn't owe them my outrage or my forgiveness. I walked past the noise, the cameras, the flashing lights, straight into the quiet of the waiting car. The ride back to the lake house was silent. I rolled down the window, letting the autumn air wash over me. Pines, smoke, the faint chill of water. I thought of Grandma's journal, tucked safely in my bag, her handwriting waiting for me on the page I had marked months ago. Sometimes blood must be drained for a body to heal. Families are no different. The words pulsed in my mind as the trees blurred past. They had tried to bury me. They had called me weak, emotional, a burden. But every time they erased me, they sharpened me. Every silence they forced became a sentence I would one day speak aloud. And when they finally handed me the shovel, expecting me to dig my own grave, I built a foundation instead. The courthouse steps emptied behind me, but the echo of the gavel still rang in my ears. The sound wasn't victory. It was finality. The car pulled away from the city, leaving glass towers and crowded sidewalks in the rearview mirror. The further we drove, the lighter the air became. The autumn trees stretched over the road like old guardians, their leaves blazing gold and red, as though the world itself was shedding its skin. I didn't look back. By the time the lake came into view, the sun was sinking low, throwing streaks of fire across the water. The house sat where it always had, quiet and weathered, its white paint chipped, its porch sagging slightly as though it too carried the weight of secrets. This was where I belonged, not in marble courtrooms or boardrooms with leather chairs. Here, where my grandmother had taught me to tie my shoes, to plant a garden, to speak my mind even when no one listened. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Everything was exactly as she'd left it: photographs on the mantel, the old quilt draped over the couch, the faint creak in the third stair. I dropped my bag by the door and walked straight to the study. The journal was there, waiting for me on the shelf, its leather cover worn soft with time. I pulled it down, sat in her chair, and opened to the last page she'd written. Family is not measured in blood. It is measured in truth. Protect the truth and you will never be alone. I traced the words with my fingertips, tears blurring the ink. She had known. She had always known what I would have to do. The night grew darker, but I didn't light a lamp. I sat by the window, watching the moon ripple across the lake. For the first time in years, I felt still. Not empty, not erased, just still. The phone buzzed on the table beside me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The world could wait. Tomorrow, the company would demand my attention. Lawyers would need signatures, journalists would chase interviews, the board would clamor for decisions. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, I belonged to her, to the silence, to the legacy that wasn't written in contracts or court orders but in love and in truth. I closed the journal and whispered into the dark, "I'll do it my way, Grandma, I promise." The lake answered with a soft breeze against the window pane, as though she was still here, nodding in approval. The morning came quietly, as if the lake itself had conspired to let me rest. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the pale light spilling across the wooden floor, gentle and unassuming. No alarm clocks, no urgent emails, just the rhythm of water brushing the shore outside. I brewed coffee the way my grandmother had taught me, slow, patient, letting the aroma fill the kitchen. The mug was chipped, the handle worn smooth by years of her hands and now mine. Sitting on the porch, I watched the mist lift from the surface of the water. For once, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a horizon. The phone buzzed again, persistent as ever. I let it ring. I knew what it was: reporters, board members, distant relatives suddenly eager to reconnect. They wanted a piece of the story, a piece of me, but I wasn't a story for them to consume. Not anymore. Later, I walked down the old dock, the wood groaning beneath my feet. I dipped my hand into the cold lake water, letting the ripples spread outward. My reflection stared back at me, not the forgotten daughter, not the erased shadow, not the burden. Quinn Hughes, whole, unshaken. I whispered the words my grandmother had left me: family is not measured in blood. It is measured in truth. The truth had cost me everything I once thought I needed: approval, belonging, love twisted into obedience. But it had also given me something greater: freedom. I stood there a long time until the chill of the water bit at my skin. Then I straightened, squaring my shoulders. I wasn't naive. The battles weren't over. The company would test me. The world would doubt me. My family, whatever remained of them, would never stop resenting me. But the war inside me was done. The silence they had used to erase me was mine now. I carried it differently, not as a wound, but as a shield. When I turned back toward the house, the wind stirred the trees, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. For the first time, it didn't feel like a place of exile. It felt like home, and home was where I would begin again, not with vengeance, not with sorrow, but with the legacy my grandmother had trusted me to protect. I walked up the porch steps, coffee still warm in my hand, the morning alive around me. The world could wait. I had already won.